All right, so I guess I caught some heat yesterday because I didn't have any Bible verses attached to what I was going to say. So yeah, actually, could I borrow your Bible real quick? I'm gonna do.
That one.
It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's like one in ESV and one in New King James or something.
I don't read the ESV.
Are two enough?
Is two enough? That's a good question. It's a fantastic question. I now have two Bibles. See, they're in my hands and they're not smoking and I'm not burning. So,
no lightning.
And unfortunately, I'm going to have to admit to some vanity here because I don't think I can read. That is way too small. Sorry. Actually, it doesn't. I'm going to do what the Neo-Calvinists do. I'm just going to read any arbitrary scripture and then talk about what I want to talk about.
That's right.
We have a third Bible here.
Oh, hey, this is even better. Has this got big words, big letters?
Yeah. Even I can read that.
Okay, here.
Now, where are you going to read from so I can find it for you?
Just pick one. Here we go. No, just kidding. Yeah, this is the Neo-Calvinist version of proof texting. Yeah, well, and then we just talk about what we want to talk about, right? Let's do this.
Pick anything out of Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon. That's pretty racy.
It's about Jesus, though.
I really am going to read a scripture so we can actually consecrate all this. So hang on one second here. I do want to find something here. Luke 4, chapter 14. And Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went about a fame of him through all the regions round about. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And there he delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them who are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, and he gave it to the minister and sat down. And all the eyes of the synagogue were fastened upon him. And he was talking about our identity. In this instance in the book of Luke, actually is the foundation for everything that Jesus says thereafter. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. Andy made the comment that that Christians were called Christians as a pejorative. And the thing that Jesus was talking about is that the Spirit anointed him to ultimately go about healing all who were oppressed of the devil. The message of Christianity has always been the Spirit of the Lord upon flesh, to heal, to set free, to liberate. So now, you Neo-Calvinists that are concerned that I'm not quoting Scripture, there we go. So now I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. Okay. We have been talking about determinism through the ages. And I, as always, wanted to give you a sense of the evolution of Western thought. Yes? And we got to here, and we talked about the expansion of Christianity in the Greek world and the influences that were actually that dominated this time period. And now we're going to talk about this right here. Augustine, the church is in the process of becoming the state, and Plotinus. It is impossible to talk about free will and Western thought without talking about Augustine, and it's impossible to talk about free will and Augustine without talking about Pelagius. Now, if you remember, for those of you who have listened to my lectures in the past, I discussed at length the impact and the relationship between Plato, Plotinus, Augustine, and Christian thought. I did that in 2013, and I did that in 2014. I told you then you wouldn't like the implications, and it doesn't get any better when I reiterate. The philosophical pedigree of Christianity starts with Plato. Right there. This is where it starts. Plato's Republic is Augustine's City of God. Plato's world of forms is Augustine's doctrine of heaven. Plato's philosopher kings is ultimately the evolution of elders and bishops in Christian ecclesiology. For those of you who can't see this, hopefully when they get this up, you'll actually be able to see this. This is going to be this PowerPoint right here. You should be able to see this online so you can actually see where I'm at. So, here's where Plato talks, but by the time we get to right here, Plato he's not in the common mind. The West has undergone a massive Cynic, Stoic, and Sophistic resurgence. These are the doctrines, and if you remember yesterday what I told you, these doctrines right here, this one, Pythagoreans, the resurgent Cynic and Sophic movement, determinism. We have a theological determinism that has risen, and it is the backdrop for Western thought. We have asceticism from here has become the moral ideal right through this section here, right? You remember this from yesterday? The philosophical energy that drove, this is the area, Paul talks a lot about Gnostics, about Gnosticism. The idea that there is a select group of individuals who have access to a unique and enlightening otherworldly knowledge. That's Gnosticism. That's the fundamentals. The Gnostic movements are sub-movements of these fundamental philosophical statements. Remember I talked about that last year, right? This is the philosophical energy that drove the Gnostic movements that plagued the early church. Gnosticism, I will reiterate, the material world and man's fleshly existence is corrupt. Man needs special revelation to escape the material corruption. Late 1st century and early 2nd century Christianity had a terrible time combating the Cynic and Stoic thought because it had accepted the metaphysical premise. Remember I told you that through this era right here, Christianity had long since decided that the Cynic and Stoic presumptions about human existence, asceticism as the highest moral ideal, they've accepted the premise. So one of the problems they had is they had no real way, once you accept that man is metaphysically, physically corrupt, once you accept that premise, the only thing left is an otherworldly spiritual existence. And this is one of the reasons that Christianity had so much trouble through this era fighting off Gnosticism. So now we got to fast forward just a touch to this man right here. Remember I told you that Plato, am I not on screen? Okay. Plato here has faded. Right about here, a guy by the name of Plotinus. He is called a Neoplatonist. Last year I gave an in-depth evaluation of Plotinus. Here's the relationship between the two. Plato held a secular philosophy, not a religious orthodoxy. He had some mystical overtones, but his focus was on man's achievement of human virtues. But human achievement and moral worth is limited to a small group of unique men who have insights that the whole of humanity does not. Plato's metaphysics formalized a transcendent reality in Western thought. This is Plato's world of forms. The transcendent reality world of forms is up here, distinct and independent of this physical reality. This physical reality is a shadow world. This was Plato's presumption. Plotinus dropped all vestiges of the humanist elements in Plato's philosophy. According to Plotinus' disciples, he detested being in his physical body. He believed in the Cynic and Stoic soul-body dichotomy, but if you will remember, anytime you hear soul-body dichotomy, I want you to remember the Pythagoreans. These are the ones who introduced this into Western thought. He accepted the mystery cult assertion, aka Gnosticism, that matter was evil and that man's every effort should be to escape this earthly existence. Man cannot do good in this material form. His only good is in transcendent existence. This is Plotinus here, right? Plotinus Neoplatonism, heavily influenced by Stoicism, infused with the Pythagorean soul-body dichotomy, is the intellectual foundation of Augustinian theology. You whispered. What did you say?
Which is the foundation for Calvinism.
Yes, that is exactly right. Now, I know there are some neo-Calvinists right now that are entirely scandalized. That can't be helped. Actually, this doesn't really require peer review because anybody with any intellectual integrity can look this up for themselves. This relationship between Plotinus, Plato, and ultimately Augustine is not hard to find. And it cannot be understated that Augustine is the theological foundation of Western Christianity. All roads in all Christian doctrines intersect at Augustine. Whatever you think you believe about Christianity, 99% of it you got from Augustine. And the parts you didn't get from him are theologically irrelevant. So now let's talk about determinism. John MacArthur, 2008 T4G conference. I got this from a transcript given to me by Paul Dose. I have every expectation it's authentic. I think this is him. If it's not, I guess he'll tell me. You know, the funny thing is I grew up listening to John MacArthur way back 20 years ago.
Grace to you.
Huh?
Grace to you.
Grace to you, yeah. Yeah, that was it. Grace to you. I want to, here's why I'm going to read this and I'm going to tell you why I'm showing you this. This is an excerpt out of his T4G conference discussion, his sermon. I have posted his entire thing on spiritualtyranny.com. I like people to have the total context. I really try to avoid taking people out of context. I want you to be able to see it in context, so I'm 99% sure I put it out there. I hope it did. If I didn't, somebody will tell me and I'll put it up. So here's what he said. If you just dropped into the world today, the evangelical world, you would think that this doctrine, total depravity, aka human inability, this is my insertion, was a recent arrival because free will doctrine is so popular today that when people hear the doctrine of total depravity, they think that it is something new. They think that the idea of man's free will and ability to contribute to his salvation is orthodox. But the fact is, this is the most historical doctrine, this doctrine of total depravity. The Bible's clear teaching on original sin has been defended as essential to Christian orthodoxy for a long time. It was not invented in modern time. It was not invented by John Calvin or Luther or any other reformer. Just a quick bit of history. You don't need a lot of this, but the quintessential episode was the Pelagian controversy early in the 5th century. As you well know, Pelagius and Celestius objected to the biblical teaching as represented by Augustine, who taught that sinners are totally unable to obey the gospel of God unless God intervenes by grace to free them from sin. According to Pelagianism, anyone who chooses to obey God can do so. Pelagianism denies that human nature is in any way defiled or disabled by inherited sin. That Adam's sin put the whole race in a hopeless bondage to sin is not true. Pelagianism says every person possesses perfect freedom of will, as Adam did. And so we sin purely by choice, not by compulsion, and not by nature. Sinners have the power to change those choices and free themselves from sin by the freedom of their own will. This idea, by the way, was formally denounced at the Council of Ephesus in 431. I read this because I want you to see the relationship between contemporary Christian thinkers and the historical record. They are buying into this relationship hook, line, and sinker. They can't at some point say, no, that's not really what we think. They are specifically buying into, and I'm using John MacArthur as representative of the dominant thought in our age, in the 21st century in America. What I'm talking about is no mere academic ivory tower nonsense. The intellectual titans shaping, and I use the word titans, intellectual titans loosely, the intellectual titans shaping modern Christianity are invested in this historical doctrine. Notice that John MacArthur draws a strict parallel between human inability and Augustine's doctrine of original sin. Now, for those of you who don't know, I ran a little homework assignment on my blog, and one of the questions I asked is, what was the doctrine of original sin? Here is a summary of the doctrine. You can look it up for more details. Here is the doctrine. Metaphysically, Augustine said that all humanity was literally present in Adam when he sinned. This existential truth fulfills Paul's assertion that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. When Adam ate the fruit, he initiated, quote unquote, the fall of man. And the whole of humanity participates in Adam's guilt. But more important, human nature was transformed. Adam and Eve, via sexual reproduction, recreate that human nature. This means that the whole of humanity is condemned. The human will is rendered morally feeble. All sinners, humans are utterly depraved in nature, lacking the freedom to do good and cannot respond to the will of God without grace. Of course, having read this, the summary I just read is effectively what John MacArthur is saying. Yes? Yes? Okay. Here is a flavor of what Augustine thought. Not only men's good wills, which God himself converts from bad ones, and when converted by him, directs to good action and to eternal life, but also those which follow the world are so entirely at the disposal of God that he turns them wherever he wills and whenever he wills to bestow kindness on some and to heap punishments on others. God works in the hearts of men to incline their wills wherever he wills, whether the good deeds according to his mercy or to evil after their own desert. This is Augustine against the Pelagians. Notice the bolded words, or to evil after their own desert. The logical question to all thinking beings is, how can God attribute any fault to human action if he intends the sin done? How does this represent justice if God metes out destruction according to his will, independent of human action? If you're a rational man, this makes a mockery of justice, because man is merely a puppet on a string with no moral responsibility. In Augustine, we see the Cynic and Stoic doctrine arrive at its only logical conclusion: the metaphysical corruption. Here we see this is the Cynic and Stoic doctrine fully formed and finalized in Augustine. From its inception, Augustine's new doctrine of original sin stood unopposed until a man named Pelagius came to Rome. As such, the controversy surrounding Pelagius was a defining moment in Western thought. Here is an extended quote from every new Calvinist's favorite theologian, R.C. Sproul. He begins, "It is Augustine who gave us the Reformation." So wrote B.B. Warfield in his assessment of the influence of Augustine on church history. It is not only that Luther was an Augustinian monk, or that Calvin quoted Augustine more than any other theologian, that provoked Warfield's remark. Rather, it was that the Reformation witnessed the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over the legacy of the Pelagian view of man. Humanism, in all of its subtle forms, recapitulates the unvarnished Pelagianism against which Augustine struggled. Though Pelagius was condemned as a heretic by Rome, and its modified form, semi-Pelagianism, was likewise condemned by the Council of Orange in 529. The basic assumptions of this view persisted throughout church history, to reappear in medieval Catholicism, Renaissance humanism, Socianism, Arminianism, and modern liberalism. The seminal thought of Pelagius survives today not as a trace or a tangential influence, but is pervasive in the modern church. Indeed, the modern church is held captive by it. I've also posted this article on spiritualtyranny.com. I'm pretty sure it just says R.C. Sproul. I think so. Anyway, it's out there. You can find it. My point with this quote is to emphasize that all Western Christian theology is measured against the Augustinian plumb line. The presumption is that Augustine's theology is biblical theology. That's the intellectual equation. If it's Augustine, it's Bible. If it's Bible, it's Augustine. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
Any challenge to Augustine is seen as a challenge to the one true faith. So now, I'm smiling, but I'm being serious. Anyone within the sound of my voice, you have been forewarned. I guarantee you that the modern-day Reformed theology shills think me a heretic for daring to take issue with the Augustinian doctrine and to speak well of a man called Pelagius. But here's the funny thing. Most of you and most Neo-Calvinist aficionados are Pelagians in practice.
Can you say that again? Could you repeat that?
Yes, but here's the funny thing. Most of you and most of the Neo-Calvinist aficionados are Pelagian or semi-Pelagian in practice. What R.C. Sproul said is true. It is a seminal thought, and Pelagius survives today, not as a trace or a tangential influence, but as is pervasive in the modern church. And this would include, in practice, most Neo-Calvinists.
In practice, not in what they preach.
Correct.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Give an example how they believe that in practice, or how it
Actually,
plays
I'm actually going to address this later.
Okay.
But I am going to. I'll use this as anecdotal. You've been in the middle of a conflict with a Neo-Calvinist. You're on the blog. You're writing, and some poor soul, usually a mother. I'm guessing by the names attached to the people in the writing, and they are wringing their hands that how all this conflict. Don't you understand that all this conflict is leading young people astray?
Mm-hmm.
If you would just play nice, the young people would see the truth, they would see the harmony, they would see the love, and they would want Jesus.
And it's not just young people, but it's unbelievers in general, too.
Yes, but usually it's some mother who is very desperately concerned about the salvation of their children's souls. And they're more scandalized. It's your tone. If you just didn't talk the way you talk, our dear children over here would see the light in life and come to God. Well, that's, by definition, there is no human agency.
Yeah.
There's no human agency. So my tone, no human conflict can account for the location of your son or daughter's soul. They either come to God because God wants it that way, or they don't because God doesn't. It's really that simple. So in practice, the argument is based on a semi-Pelagian perspective, the presumption that human action actually has an impact. There is some human agency in bringing people to God. That would be an example of it in practice.
And even the whole scandal, if you want to call it, the latest one, even with. I'm sensitive to this because I have a lot of friends who are all wrapped up in the whole thing going on with Bob Jones and the Grace Report. And the thing you constantly hearing coming from the Bob Jones supporters is, well, think about what this does for the cause of Christ.
Exactly. Yeah, anytime somebody makes an appeal that some human action is somehow undermining God's salvific plan, they are defaulting, they are betraying the very presumptions of their predetermination. It's that simple. There is no human agency. Zero human agency. If God's grace stands totally isolated unto itself, there is no human agency. So then to make an appeal to human agency, or to make a change, to make a demand that there should be some actionable change on on man's part, it's false. It's just that simple. It is false. So that's what I mean.
Okay.
Most people are semi-Pelagian in practice, when in actual fact they are insisting that they are Calvinist, and we're going to see where this goes. Give me about 2 minutes here.
So, I get emails from one particular person who wrote an article entitled, a blogger wrote an article entitled, Paul Dosey, Enemy of the Cross. Okay. So, like, that's a bad thing. I mean, to your point, if everything's for the glory of God, if everything's according to His will, like you just read from Augustine, so how is me even being an enemy of the cross necessarily a bad thing?
Actually,
Like
it can't be a
evil or
bad thing,
something.
and by definition, what he should say is Paul Dosey, an enemy of the cross, Al Mohler, an enemy of the cross, R.C. Sproul, an enemy of the cross. We are all functionally,
Right.
metaphysically enemies of the cross. So it really is no distinction.
So basically what you're talking about, their whole mentality is metaphysically upside down.
Well, what I'm saying is that they're not at all consistent. Ultimately, if what they preach is true, then they can't have these other standards.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
Okay. Pelagius was condemned by the church, and the church made every effort to destroy his work. I'm going to say that again. It's a little abrupt in transition. Pelagius was condemned, and the church set out to purge his work from public consumption. So we actually have very little of what the man said available to us. What we do have is, what surviving sources we do have are mostly from his critics. Justin and Augustine, I think, primarily. Of course, the council's keeping track of whatever he had to say while he was under indictment for heresy. But we do have a couple of surviving documents. I'm going to go ahead and read through my notes here. According to the records we have, Pelagius was very likely from Britain. He is an ascetic and is often referred to as a monk. Somehow he got a very good education. He had a broad mastery of Christian canon. He knew Latin and Greek, and he had an understanding of the patristic writings. And the patristic writings are the writings that come right through here. Here is basically the formation of New Testament canon, right in here, and the patristics, they come back in through this area here. He arrives in Rome circa 380. Rome's wealth collides with his ascetic standards. Remember, I told you that in this era right through here, Christianity has already accepted asceticism. Actually, I'm up in this direction here. Christianity has already accepted asceticism as the moral standard. So he is scandalized by the relative wealth. And of course, he's coming from Britain. Way back then, Britain would have been I mean, how many of you watched television shows with the Vikings? I mean, this is the hinterlands, for heaven's sake. By the time he gets to Rome, he's gotten to the big city, and this collides with his ascetic mindset. And he is specifically appalled by the moral lax standards of the Christian leadership in Rome. To combat the moral failing, he taught that grace and baptism infused the believer with the power to walk the path to perfection. He said that Roman Christians squandered their baptism and lapsing back into their old comfortable habits of self-indulgence and the careless pursuit of mammon. The message struck a chord with the disenfranchised by the growing gap between the clergy and the people. The clergy was ever increasingly seen as the wealthy and the rich, which they were because they stole money from people. And the people who didn't have any money, they were the people that were disenfranchised. And basically what you're hearing in Pelagius at this point is an early version of the social gospel. Pelagius gains influence in Rome for roughly 25 years, but the controversy does not start until roughly 405. It is reported that he heard a priest, and here is what starts the fight. it is reported that he heard a priest reciting the following passage from Augustine's Confessions. And this is the priest talking. My hope is, he's talking and he is reciting Augustine. My hope is in thy exceeding great mercy and that alone. Give what thou commandest and command what thou wilt. Thou commandest continence from me, and when I knew that no one could be continent unless God gave it to him. Even this was a point of wisdom to know whose gift it was. For by continence we are bound up and brought back together in the one. Whereas before we were scattered abroad among the many. For he loves thee too little, who loves along with thee anything else that he does not love for thy sake. O love, who dost burn forever and art never quenched. O love, O my God, enkindle me. Thou commandest continence, give what thou commandest, and command what thou wilt. Pelagius is scandalized by this prayer. He said that it destroys moral responsibility by turning man into a mere marionette. This conflict inspired him to write the commentary on the Pauline epistles, where he detailed his opposition to Augustine's doctrine. Augustine's doctrine of original sin, predestination, and the necessity of baptism to spare infants from hell. In 409, he ends up in Palestine and is confronted by Jerome, Augustine's theological ally. Jerome equated Pelagius' doctrine of sinlessness with the doctrines taught by Origen. Origen's teaching was recently condemned as heresy, and Jerome's smear campaign succeeded in getting a formal charge of heresy brought against Pelagius. He was brought before Bishop John of Jerusalem at the Synod of Jerusalem and Diospolis. 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 Okay, well, somebody can help my pronunciations out. Anyway, in this synod, these are actually two synods, and he was actually brought before them in the year 415. Pelagius admitted to his doctrine, but successfully distanced himself from Origen. The synod of this place says, therefore concluded, now, since we have received satisfaction in respects to the charges brought against the monk Pelagius in his presence, and since he gives his assent to sound doctrine, but condemns and anathematizes those contrary to the faith of the church, we adjudge him to belong to the communion of the Catholic Church. Well, this is fantastic. His first confrontation with church authority, he's actually absolved. And this, after he gets done with this, he is actually inspired to write, after his acquittal, 2 treatises, On Nature and On Free Will. These books did not survive the Catholic purge. But we do know of these works because Pelagius said that Augustine and Jerome were under the influence. But we do know that in these works, Pelagius said that Augustine and Jerome were under the influence of the Manichaeans. Augustine's new doctrine of original sin restored evil to a Manichaean status. Augustine's predestination was the same as the Manichaean fatalism. What is the Manichaean doctrine of evil? Here it is in sum. It is a dualistic cosmology, 2 worlds, one of good, spirit and light, one of evil, material and darkness. Light is removed from the world of matter and returned to the world of light from where it came. Hot quiz. Where have we heard that before? This has been the dominant presumption throughout the whole of Western thought.
Plato.
Huh?
Plato.
This is Plato. This is the Pythagoreans. This is the Cynics. This is the Stoics. The Manichaeans were yet one more variant on effectively the same theme. Now, they had their own distinctions, maybe. If I remember correctly, Manny, the guy who was responsible for this particular doctrine, was this huge eclectic thinker. He pretty much invited anybody to believe pretty much anything. But one of the distinctions was ultimately the soul-body dichotomy, right? Where have we heard this before? The Pythagoreans, the Stoics, the Cynics, Plotinus. Note the phrase in Augustine's confession, "For by continence we are bound up and brought back to the one." For those of you who heard my discussion last year, when I was talking about Plotinus, do you remember when he talked about the one? Plotinus was making a reference to his definition of God. We see this influence right dead square in the middle of Augustine's prayer. He's basically taking Plotinus' concept and plagiarizing it and putting it in the middle of Christianity. So the question is, was Pelagius right? Was his assessment of Augustine's doctrine correct? Since we know that Augustine got his philosophical framework from Plotinus, I think it is fair to say that Pelagius was on to a key corruption within Augustinian theology. Pelagius also rejected the new doctrine of original sin, calling it an abomination. Editorial: I'm confident you have heard me say the new doctrine of original sin. And I'm doing that on purpose. Because the doctrine of original sin, as we understand it, does not exist until the 5th century. It is new when Augustine talks about it. He creates it out of whole cloth. Now, for many of you, that is profoundly staggering because you have always heard of original sin and you have always heard of the fall of man. But it is new. It did not exist. There was the first person to suggest the phrase original sin, I believe, comes from a guy by the name of Irenaeus, a bishop in Lyons. If you look up what Irenaeus said, it doesn't look anything like the doctrine of original sin that I previously reviewed. Augustine takes it, creates it out of whole cloth. Keep this in mind. When Pelagius objects to the doctrine of original sin, it was not a universally accepted doctrine. By admission, Sproul and MacArthur both say that it is ultimately validated later, after the fact, by various councils, right? After the fact. So they had to decide with whether what Augustine was saying was true or not. It didn't show up true, and then they said, yea, verily, it must be. They actually had to validate it after the fact. So when Pelagius is actually combating this idea, he believes he's on the same intellectual playing field with Augustine. Now, ultimately, Augustine has the advantage of being a central figure within church politics. Pelagius does not. Pelagius ultimately says, man's nature was not tainted by the sin of Adam. Therefore, man could not inherit hell or damnation. Pelagius saw Christians using human fragility, human frailty as an absolving excuse for their imperfections living the Christian life. Pelagius rejected the Augustinian doctrine that man gains salvation only through the church. Because this is exactly where Augustine's doctrine goes. The only way you can ever be saved is ultimately if you are specifically submitted and consecrated by those in charge of the church. Pelagius held the doctrine of free will. Responsibility always implies ability. If God commands it, man must have the ability to obey the command. If the individual is responsible for his actions, the individual was responsible for his actions. Therefore, every sin was done as a deliberate act of contempt against God. Now, we do have at least one, the one that I'm familiar with at this rate, document by Pelagius. It's called The Letter to Demetrius. I do have a PDF version of this. It's not online, but I do plan on actually putting it up on spiritualtyranny.com so you can read it in whole. And here's what Pelagius said. It's two excerpts out of what he said. It really will give you a flavor. Whatever I have to speak on the subject of moral instruction and the conduct of a holy life, it is my practice first to demonstrate the power and quality of human nature and to show what it is capable of achieving. You ought to measure the good of human nature by reference to its creator. I mean God, of course. If it is he who, as report goes, has made all the works and within the world good, how much more excellent do you suppose that he made man himself? He provided him with a better arraignment than other creatures, that is, with reason and wisdom. Moreover, the Lord of justice wishes man to be free to act and not under compulsion. It was for this reason that he left him free to make his own decisions. It is on this choice between two ways, on this freedom to choose either alternative, that the glory of the rational mind is based. This is Pelagius. Now I want you to think a minute, when I actually put this up, think of the profound difference if this had been the dominant thought of Christianity coming out of the 5th century. And when you read his whole document, it's full of this. The fundamental premise that human beings are morally right to their rational mind and are empowered by God to take moral action. The kerfuffle between Augustine and Pelagius continues until Pope Innocent I, in January of 417, answered the Synod of Carthage and Mileve, M-I-L-E-V-E, declaring the excommunication of Pelagius. Augustine, in September of 417, announces from the pulpit at Hippo, 2 synods have written to the Apostolic See about this matter. The replies have come back. The question is settled. Ultimately, Pelagius is condemned by the Church, by the Catholic Church, and he pretty much vanishes from history. We don't know what happens to him after that. Now, I do have an editorial here. An editorial comment. In 2015, John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul and a host of other Protestant New Calvinist aficionados insist that the historic councils are correct. And the question of original sin, the fall of man, pervasive depravity, and determinism are settled. Here's my question. How can a bunch of Protestants who have abandoned the Catholic Church make any claim to the authority or intellectual traditions of the Catholic Church? Or more bluntly, how can Al Mohler, R.C. Sproul, Ligon Duncan, and a host of Reform theology aficionados continue to claim a right to the authority of historic councils without renouncing their open rebellion against Catholic orthodoxy? We're revisiting a quote by Augustine. I'm sorry, R.C. Sproul.
I guess I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
There's been a groundwork laid for over 500 years, okay, that of course has led to a relaxation of the law due to the fact of, everything's about justification and man's inability to reason whether saved or unsaved. So basically, I think that we have men who know they're dealing with a herd and a mass of lazy thinkers. Okay? So, because the councils are old, okay, and consistent and attended to by the church fathers, quote unquote, they know that they can put that out there as a proof, and that the average Christian isn't going to think past the antiquity of it, which equals authority.
Exactly right.
They know great a well the average Christian sitting into the pew is not going to think under the surface and say, wait a minute. R.C. Sproul is constantly railing against the Catholic Church, and John Piper as well. Okay? And I think that's it in a nutshell. They know what they're dealing with.
You think that's it? You think it's a deliberate deception?
I do. Absolutely. No, I don't think it's deliberate perception or a deliberate deception. I think it comes from the viewpoint of the mythological noble lie. Okay? We're the philosopher kings. The great unwashed masses are not able to bear the real truth of the glory of God. So we can only lead them according to what they can understand. So it's not like they think it's an outright lie. They just think the real truth is more than the average Christian can bear. Okay? And that's what we call, and this is also the roots of mythology, okay? That the masses can't bear the real truth, so we have to make up metaphysical stories that they can understand. And I think it's the deliberate, noble lie that comes from arrogance of spiritual caste.
Anybody else have an idea they want to offer? I think it's pretty good. I guess my point, and I'll put a fine point on this to the people that are watching. They have no intellectual right to the councils. By definition, as Protestants, they have forcibly rejected the crux of Catholic orthodoxy, which is submission to the Catholic structure, the Catholic ecclesiological structure. By definition, they have rejected the foundation of authority that makes the councils, at least in the Catholic Church mind, valid. So every time you hear a modern preacher talk about a council, the first question out of your mouth should be, then why haven't you gone back and submitted to Catholic authority? It's the first question out of your mouth. And of course, I don't care what their validation is. They have no valid rebuttal to that. The only valid rebuttal is, you know what, you're exactly right. I need to go back and submit to the Catholic Church. And by the way, I think this is true. Dr. Shelton, if it's not true, sorry, I don't mean to tell stories on you, but I had my church history teacher, Dr. Shelton, at Oral Roberts University. Right about the time I was in his class, fantastic church history class, by the way, he was toying with the idea that he had a moral responsibility to abandon Protestantism and go back and do the Catholic faith, no matter if they were wrong. Because if we assume he thought that the only way the church would ever be reconciled is if there was a reconciliation between East and West that starts in 1080, I think that's the first split, and then of course ultimately the Protestant split. And he thought ultimately he believed in apostolic succession, I'm pretty sure, and he believed that he had a moral responsibility to go back and reconcile himself to Rome, and he believed the whole of the Protestant movement had the same thing. Like I said, Dr. Sheldon, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think that's where you were at, and I think later that's what you did. And I thought actually it was very intellectually consistent. I ultimately don't agree with his conclusion, but that is consistent. And modern preachers that stand up on the pulpit, modern Protestant preachers who stand up on the pulpit and insist that they have ecclesiological independence and at the same time make an appeal back to the historic councils and creeds are theological frauds. And it's really that simple.
Well, they unequivocally they claim Augustine.
Oh, absolutely. And that was exactly why I put MacArthur and Sproul's comments in.
Right. Who is...
And they have no intellectual right to Augustine.
Well, he's a doctor of the Catholic Church. But they use him as a bridge. They use him as some... when I used to be in electronics, it was a rectifier. What's it called? Sounds like idioms. I forget what the component is called. okay? But it's a rectifier. It's an electronic rectifier, okay? And somehow Augustine is some kind of filter that filters out the evil of the Catholic Church, but yet on the other side comes the authority that they need to validate apostolic succession.
Well, they don't have a choice, because if they're going to lay claim to Luther, they have no choice but to lay claim to Augustine. There can be no philosophical breach between the two. Luther doesn't show up out of whole cloth in the middle of nowhere. Luther is Augustine.
The founding document, the very first document of the Protestant Reformation, was a disputation to the Augustinian order.
Correct.
And people buy this, and they don't even blink. It's incredible.
Well, don't they, not disputing what you say, but aren't they going to make their distinction somewhere else?
Where?
Between Protestantism and Catholicism. They're
Right.
going to make their distinction saying, well, Catholicism believes works salvation, and we believe by salvation by faith alone.
Or Catholicism denied their original origins.
That's what they're going to
on some.
They're going to say that.
They're going to equivocate.
Yeah, they're going to say that. They're going to try and make some distinction. Now, you and I both know in study, we know full well that the doctrines are exactly the same.
Right.
But they're going to make the distinction to try and, separate themselves from that and say, this is why we're right and they're wrong. And you're right, it's intellectually dishonest, but that's the distinction that they're going to make, is this whole faith alone nonsense.
Well, but they do not tolerate that same logic in their own churches. How many people within their own churches stand up and say, here's where I think you've deviated from the truth, and immediately they appeal to their authority to dictate whether we're wrong or not. They appeal to the right to dictate whatever the theological direction is, independent of your judgment. So why is it they have a unique right to judgment against the Catholic Church, but you, in part of their congregation, have no right
To make the same judgment.
to make the same judgment? And this is why I say that it's theologically and intellectually bankrupt. These men have no right to their early councils and creeds. The only way they do is to repent of their rebellion and go reconcile themselves to the Catholic Church first. Then come tell me how I've erred in my doctrine.
Right.
Right. There is no distinction that they can point to in any of the creeds or councils, but the neo-Calvinist distinction that they make is, here it is, infused righteousness or infused grace. And I'm not going to go there. Obviously, we don't have time. But Catholics believe that God actually infused righteousness within us. And Luther believed, no, that all righteousness, alien righteousness, is outside of us. And I'm not going to get into that, but it boils down really to an argument between Plato and Aristotle, is what it is.
Okay, like I said, I got 33 pages of notes here. It is 2 o'clock. I've said a lot. I'm going to let you guys cogitate. We'll come back here, 15 minutes-ish?
15 minutes? Okay.